Hi, everyone. So this is Dr. Victoria Nalule, and I'm the host for this webinar, which is also part of the African Energy Transitions book launch. So this specific webinar, it's more of a debate, an energy debate, and the question is Africa ready to bid farewell to fossil fuels? Hi, everyone. So this is Dr. Victoria Nalule, and I'm the host for this webinar, which is also part of the African Energy Transitions book launch. So this specific webinar, it's more of a debate, an energy debate, and the question is Africa ready to bid farewell to fossil fuels? Hi everyone, so this is Dr. Victoria Nalule, and I'm the host for this webinar, which is also part of the African Energy Transitions book launch. So the specific webinar is more of a debate, an energy debate, and the question is Africa ready to bid farewell to fossil fuels? So this is Dr. Victoria Nalule, and I'm the host for this webinar, which is also part of sorry about that. I think the video was playing on YouTube, so I kept hearing my own echoes. But I'll go ahead to call upon our moderator who will start with the session. Sorry about that. The webinar is live on my YouTube channel, Victoria Nalule. So feel free to share with all your contacts, and you can also watch the video after this particular webinar. So Pooja, I call upon you to take over as a moderator. Pooja, I think you're on mute.
Greetings, everyone.
Sorry?
Hello?
Hello, Pooja, we can hear you.
Okay. I'm trying to. Is the screen being shared?
No, it hasn't shared. But I think you can just call upon the panelists to introduce themselves.
Okay. So my name is Pooja Karia. I'm an advocate and legal researcher in Tanzania, and currently a PhD student at the University of Cape Town. I'm your moderator for today's webinar, titled The Energy Debate, Is Africa Ready to Bid Farewell to Fossil Fuels? We will begin with the introduction of panelists, and I call upon the panelists to introduce themselves, beginning with Dr. Victoria.
Thank you very much, Pooja, for that. So I've already introduced myself. I'm Victoria Nalule. I'm a research fellow with the Extractives Hub based at the Center for Energy, Petroleum, Mineral and Policy at the University of Dundee. And I'm also the executive director of a self-funded NGO called the African Energy and Minerals Management Initiative. And I'm very excited to be here taking part in this energy debate. Thank you very much, Pooja.
Thank you, Dr. Victoria. I now call upon Dr. Geoffrey Wood to introduce.
Maybe you can go to another panelist. I can't find Geoffrey.
Okay. Dr. Nathaniel Babajide, please introduce yourself.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to this energy debate. My name is Dr. Nathaniel Babajide. I'm a lecturer in Renewable Energy, Economics, and Technology at the Center for Energy, Mineral Law and Policy at the University of Dundee. So I badged my PhD in Energy Economics and also my MSc in Oil and Gas Economics. Once again, you are welcome. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Nathaniel. I call upon Ms. Taciana to introduce yourself, please.
Hello, thank you again for the invitation to be part of this interesting debate. I'm a Mozambican lawyer with the LLM in energy law. I'm a researcher on energy transition aspects, a co-founder of MWE, Mozambique Women of Energy, and also managing director of TPLA, which is a law firm that works mainly with energy projects in Mozambique.
Thank you, Ms. Taciana. Mr. Peter, please introduce yourself.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone from Kampala. My name is Peter Muliisa. I'm an energy lawyer. I hold a master's in an LLM in petroleum taxation and finance from the University of Dundee. I work currently as the company secretary, head of legal and corporate affairs department in the Uganda National Oil Company. I'm quite excited about the topic today, and I can't wait to hear the presentations from all the panelists. It's a very important debate. It's a very important item that everybody should be looking at. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Peter. Dr. Geoffrey Mabea, please introduce yourself.
Geoffrey, I think you're on mute, sorry. Okay.
My apologies for that. My name is Geoffrey Mabea. I'm the Executive Secretary of the Energy Regulators Association of East Africa, and also a former student of CEPMLP Dundee. My specialization is energy economics and policy. So once again, I'm so thrilled and excited to join the panelists in this discussion, and I look forward to learning more and of course sharing the strategic perspectives of what is going on in this African energy. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Geoffrey. Is Dr. Geoffrey online? Geoffrey Wood?
I can't see him online, but I think we can start, he'll find us.
All right. So before we begin, we'll check on some housekeeping rules. Each of our panelists will have 10 minutes of presentation. Participants can ask their questions on the question and answer forum. And our panelists will try their best to respond on the forum. In the meantime, for the questions that are not answered, after the presentations, we'll take 20 minutes to answer the unanswered questions. And depending on how it ends, we will have a short networking session. We will now begin and invite Dr. Victoria Nalule to answer the question, how just is the just transition to a low carbon economy in Africa? Dr. Victoria, you are welcome on board.
Thank you, Pooja. Please stop sharing. Okay. All right, thank you very much. So I'm trying to share my slides because I know it's more of a debate, but most people requested us to make just a few slides. And also it's good to have the slides for the YouTube video. So that my question is, how just is a just transition to a low carbon economy? And just bear with me, let me get my slide ready. So first, the theme of the debate is Africa ready to bid farewell to fossil fuels? And my answer to that, of course, it's no, we're not ready. We can respond to energy transitions, but at the same time, we still need oil and gas for our economic development and population growth, as I'll be discussing in my presentation. So I've already told you about myself. I work with the Extractive Hub, but also I have research interest in the African energy and mining sectors. And to that respect, I have 4 books, 2 already published, 1 coming up, and also another one coming up. And so those are some of my books, and I'm sure I've shared with most of the participants copies of my books, soft copies, but if you haven't got any of the books, feel free to reach out. So I have only 10 minutes, so I'll make this brief. Before we start on the discussion on whether Africa is ready to say goodbye to fossil fuels, we have to first understand and appreciate the key facts that really answer the question as to whether we are ready to say goodbye to fossil fuels. So as I mentioned, at first I said we are not ready to say goodbye, and now I'm trying to justify the reasons as to why we are not ready. First, basing on the facts, urbanization is expected to escalate on the African continent. We can see that estimates show that over 2 billion people are likely to live in urban centers by 2040, and Africa makes up 1/3 of that urbanization. So with urbanization comes the need for more consumption for energy, including fossil fuels and renewable energy. So that means by 2040, we'd still need our oil and gas to take us through the various urbanization stages on the African continent. Now, to leave alone urbanization, we also noticed that Goal 7 of the UN Sustainable Development Goals focuses on access to modern energy, but we noticed that on the African continent, over 600 million people have no access to electricity. So if we really need to tackle the issue of energy access, that means we will need to utilize whatever energy resources we have, including renewables and oil and gas, to tackle the issue of energy access. And besides that, we also note that population growth is estimated to boom. And estimates show that around 1.7 billion people will be living in urban centers. Like the growth will increase by around 1.7 to reach 9.2 billion people in 2040. So with population growth, that means that many people will need more energy resources. And that means many people need oil and gas to rely on, to use for urbanization, to use for in their own homes, or even industrialization. So all these point to the fact that we still need fossil fuels. Now, yeah, that is the thing, we still need fossil fuels, but what about the energy transition debate that is going on currently? With the global move to tackle climate change, as evidenced in the 2015 Paris Agreement, we're seeing many countries globally, we're seeing many international organizations putting a lot of focus on tackling climate change, putting a lot of focus on investing in renewable energy, which is not a bad thing, because definitely we do need to take care of our environment. But however, all these global moves are going to affect African countries, both positively and negatively. How will it affect, how is the energy transition going to affect us negatively? We're evidencing many financial institutions cutting down on finances for fossil fuel projects. And we're seeing also lots of policymakers being put on pressure to, before they even get any funding for an oil and gas project, they have to show some kind of master plan of how they are moving towards energy transitions. So we're seeing a decline in finances for fossil fuels, and that's how the energy transitions debate is negatively affecting African countries. So I'll still go to the key facts here. Like I mentioned, we still need fossil fuels because of population growth, urbanization, and also industrialization. But the fact is the finances are decreasing globally. Whether we are ready or not, we have to respond. Policymakers have to take the issue or the subject of energy transition seriously, because at the end of the day, oil and gas projects are capital intensive. We need the finances, but how will we get the finances when most financial institutions and oil companies are shying away from investing in fossil fuels? So why do we still need finances for infrastructure development? This is a map of the West African gas pipeline, and estimates show that all the gas that is being cleared in Nigeria is capable of electrifying the entire ECOWAS region. That's the same thing even in other African countries. If we can utilize the energy resources we have, including fossil fuels, oil, gas, then that means that we can easily be able to tackle the issue of energy access. But however, this is not only in words, in the infrastructure, because with energy access, you notice the issue of affordability, accessibility, but the focus on accessibility is, do we have the necessary energy infrastructure to ensure that the people can actually have access to modern energy or to electricity? So in this map here, you see, in this graph, I'm sure I noted it in my last presentation for the 22nd May, you see the fact that there is a difference between energy poverty and poverty generally, because most people think energy poverty means like people can't afford access to modern energy because they are poor. But in this graph, you see in blue, even those people who are above the poverty line, they lack access to modern energy, including electricity, and most of them rely on biomass or charcoal and firewood for cooking. And then you see here for people who are below the poverty line, it's understandable as to why they lack access to modern energy. So the key fact here is there's a difference between energy poverty and energy access. Now for this graph, like I mentioned, we still need fossil fuels because of the key important sectors that are likely to play a major role in urbanization and industrialization on the African continent, including the transport sector, industry, and then buildings. And here estimates show that by 2040, all these sectors will entirely be relying on fossil fuels. So for the African continent, we are not ready to say goodbye to fossil fuels, but however, we have to react to the energy transitions debate that is going on globally.
Dr. Victoria, what are your concluding remarks?
Thank you. So yeah, that means I need to wrap up. So, but my entire discussion was not ready to bid farewell to fossil fuels because we still need the fossil fuels. Now, my concluding remarks is how just is the just transition to a low carbon economy? In my opinion, there's nothing that the concept of energy justice doesn't apply to African countries, because first and foremost, if you note the word justice in a way that is morally right and fair, and one might ask, what is fair about having over 1.2 billion people having no access to modern energy? And how morally right is it for the international community to cut down on funding for fossil fuels, yet they know the people in Africa still need these fossil fuels to move on to urbanization and population growth? So is the concept of just transition applicable in Africa? And my answer is no, it's not applicable, because with justice, we should be able to utilize the 65 billion barrels of oil we have on the African continent. And with justice, we should see the international community investing more in infrastructure development, and ensuring that many people have access to modern energy, and ensuring that finances are available for these countries to utilize all the energy resources they have. So that's it for me. Thank you very much, Pooja. I hope I haven't gone beyond my time. So in conclusion, there's no justice in the energy transition because everything is moving towards affecting the African continent in utilizing its energy resources. But nevertheless, I do realize, or I do recognize the fact that we have to tackle climate change, and my co-panelists will be able to address the issue of renewable energy and also the practicability of the Paris Agreement. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Victoria.
Hi there, can anyone see my video?
No, I think, Pooja, you have to stop sharing so that Geoffrey can come in.
Yes, I was just wanting to invite Dr. Geoffrey.
Okay.
For the second question, that is, how are global energy transition developments likely to affect Africa? Dr. Geoffrey, you are welcome on board.
Hi there, good afternoon. First of all, the screen is blocking me from showing up my
Oh, sorry, just a minute.
keyboard.
Okay, you can share now.
Excellent. Hi there, so good afternoon. My name is Dr. Geoffrey Wood. I'm a researcher in global energy transitions at the Department of Urban Planning at the University of Dundee. No webcam here. Is there any chance I can get my webcam put on because it's not coming up? Or can you see the slides?
We can see the slides. You have to enable your video yourself.
Okay. So what I'm going to talk about today is the progress today in energy transitions. All right, hold on one second. We'll look at what we mean by energy transitions in terms of unpacking the concept and look at the implications of Africa, followed by some thoughts from my talk, particularly in relation to whether Africa is ready to bid farewell to fossil fuels. Okay, so looking at energy transitions then, the rising temperatures and rising risks of climate change are global in nature. No nation is immune to the crisis, and Africa is particularly vulnerable to the negative impacts of climate change. The term energy transition has become popular with regard to how to address climate change and transition from a high carbon to a low carbon climate friendly energy source system. It is common practice to use these days to use the term in the same way we use low carbon, green energy, renewable, but what does it mean specifically? In a sense, globally, it is to make the world a better place somehow. Now, the assumption in energy transition is that renewable energy will be rolled out globally to meet international domestic targets, and that less developed nations will need extra support. With so much discussion and mainstreaming about energy transition, it is important to look at the actual reality. Fossil fuels continue to account for 80% of total global energy consumption, has done so for decades, and projections by various reputable bodies, including the IEA, will do so for many years to come. What's perhaps surprising for a lot of people is that the share of coal has not just remained the same for the last 2 decades, but in real terms has increased. Of concern, despite exponential growth in renewable capacity being deployed globally, it has stagnated in relative terms with the growth in fossil fuel use. The simple story then is that carbon emissions are up at a time when we need to be reducing greenhouse gas emissions, and time is almost up, as warned in stark terms by the IPCC report recently. I'll now discuss a couple of graphs which reinforce the points made from the previous slides. Global investment in US dollars in 2018 for renewables was $289 billion. As can be seen from the graph, there is only limited investment moving into Africa. And combined data for Africa and the Middle East shows that just 5% of total global new investment in renewables shifted into that region. It's of depressing note that the data between Africa and Middle East is not even disaggregated, showing that there are small players at the moment. The second graph shows that Africa, in contrast to embarking on an energy transition, is still a major source of fossil fuel subsidies, highlighting the importance and, at times, depending on nations, on fossil fuel subsidies and high carbon. The rest of the world is no different, though. Indeed, when we talk about whether Africa is ready or not to bid farewell to fossil fuels, perhaps we should be asking the question, is the world ready? The one answer we know at the moment is that climate change does not care if we're ready or not. So let's have a look at what we mean when we talk about energy transitions. To date, we have agreed on a temperature limit. However, the agreed temperature target is 2 degrees centigrade to limit the rise by 2 degrees centigrade. This is insufficient to meet the Paris Agreement, and the actual realistic target of 1.5 degrees centigrade remains merely aspirational. There's also no consensus regarding the end goals of energy transition. Where are we going? What are we trying to do? What do we need to change? Is it simply reducing greenhouse gas emissions, or envisaging a wider systemic change, a paradigm change to incorporate the tenets of energy justice, ownership, participation, engagement, and democracy? Indeed, there are not even any proper legal definitions for what constitutes a renewable energy or low carbon energy source, compounding the problem. Typically, they're often defined legally by what they are not, rather than what they are, including intrinsic properties such as renewable, naturally replenishing. What then are we talking about? A simple transition or a transformation, even revolution, in how we produce, use and consume energy? First, let's have a look at transition before turning our attention to transformation as we seek to unpack the energy transition concept a little bit more. So at the root of the word transition, it means going across. And this understanding has been taken by some to mean simply switching from high carbon to low carbon, for example, coal to gas, with the resultant greenhouse gas emission cuts of around about 50% per kilowatt hour of energy generated. This is a simple, elegant answer, but provides no wider changes as it runs the risk of leaving us with large-scale centralized energy systems, for example, thermal plants switching to large biomass solar or wind farms. This means we need more of the same infrastructure, more centralized networks, grids, pipelines for power, gas and oil, and ownership by a few large-scale, typically multinational corporations or state-owned assets. What this means then is that it limits the ability for new players, new entrants to come into the market, limits liquidity in the energy markets, and it reinforces path dependency and lock-in of the traditional, the old system, the one that we all agree in energy transition is not fit for purpose when we're looking for a decentralized, more nuanced system. Transition then risks failing to address problems of the current energy system, and ability to achieve the wider goals of energy transition. Changing shape then, in contrast, the root for the word transformation suggests the need for more fundamental change of the existing energy system to meet the greatest challenge facing humanity, climate change. A transformation then potentially opens the space to develop new models of partnerships between private bodies, public and community, deploy different scales of energy infrastructure and networks. For example, off-grid, local grid, small-scale generation, and has the potential to stimulate behavioural change in the way we produce, use and consume energy in innovative ways. In short, transformation has the potential to address and acknowledge the wider goals of energy transition. So this brings us to the implications for Africa. It's clear around the world there are different contexts and different speeds, and it's important to recognise that Africa is not a homogeneous continent. But what is clear is that 61% of people around the world without access to electricity and 33% without access to clean cooking live in sub-Saharan Africa. Fossil fuels comprise a majority of the energy mix of the nations of Africa. And at the same time, the need to develop is critical. And this can't be ignored in debates on energy transition. There's also a lack of conventional energy infrastructure, and this is compounded by the failure of the global community in terms of finance and technology streams as per agreed in the Paris Agreement. So this opens up the question of the need for a dual or multi-track energy transitions around the world.
Dr. Geoffrey, sorry, what are your concluding remarks? You have 2 minutes.
Yep, I'm almost there. On the positive side, because there are many positives in Africa, vast potential for renewables. All African nations have renewable resources, unlike fossil fuels reserves. You already have 4 regional power pools, and in conjunction with the vast potential for renewable energy, this has benefits for variable renewable storage and demand responses. You have the UN Sustainability Goals framework, and there's lots of exciting and innovative bottom-up grassroots projects and partnerships building capacity of renewables. An increasing renewable energy capacity frees fossil fuels for export, and you can recycle the revenue to green initiatives and not lose out on developing in the countries of Africa. So some concluding thoughts then. Africa has vast renewable energy potential. There's no reason why it can't be utilised. But perhaps Africa needs to ask what type of energy transition it envisages. What is the goal? What is the vision? Is it inevitably going to be different from Europe and the United States? Innovate. There'll be the need for new partnerships and ways of doing, particularly without national or continental-wide infrastructure for transmission. And African nations need to be more than just simple recipients of finance and technology. Local capacity needs to be developed in terms of jobs, expertise, knowledge, practice. And it's also important to realise the wider goals of energy transition. So on that note, with a little cartoon to hope that we don't make this mistake, thank you very much for listening.
Thank you very much, Dr. Geoffrey. Please stop sharing the screen. While I introduce the next panelist, I applaud Dr. Victoria for the vigorous answering of the questions on the question and answer panel. I request the other panelists to have a look at the questions and keep answering the questions. I now welcome Dr. Nathaniel to answer the question, Renewable energy deployment in Africa. What are the barriers to energy transition? Dr. Nathaniel, you're welcome on board.
Thank you very much. I'm excited to be here, to be part of this interesting debate. Now, I would like to share my screen for better understanding of some of the thoughts that I will be unleashing in this particular discussion. Okay, this is the outline of my presentation. I would like to start by providing a kind of a short overview of Africa, provide a kind of a synopsis of current situation in the continent, the energy prospect in the continent, and then provide some information about the challenges and a concluding remark. Now, these are just some vital information about the continent, just to lay a very solid background for some of the things that we'll be discussing. So considering the population of the continent of about 1.3 billion people, which account for 16% of the global population, and this is a continent of GDP of about 2.58 trillion as of 2018, growing at a very impressive rate of 1.5, as in 3.5% per annum. So, which is a very promising economy. But notwithstanding, the poverty level is relatively high, more than 50%, and the per capita GDP, which is the yardstick for assessing the performance or the economic well-being of people in the continent, is about $1,970, which is about 3 times lower than the global average of about $6,000. So, which is telling us that the poverty level is relatively, as in extremely high in the continent. So these are some of the information about the energy reserve in the country, as in the continent. The crude oil reserve of more than 125 billion barrels of crude oil, natural gas, as well as coal. So now, looking at the situation now, what are the issues associated with the energy system in the continent? For instance, the continent holds about 7% of the world's oil and gas reserve. As depicted in this particular table, we can see that Africa accounts for about 7.2% of total global oil reserves and 7.3% of that of natural gas. So which tells us that the reserve for fossil fuel in the continent is very huge. But with all these issues, with this huge fossil fuel endowment, there are quite a number of issues that we need to properly look into as we are trying to, as in to debate on whether the transition is even is something that is very nearby or something that is feasible in the continent. So the continent accounts for 7% and 3% of world's energy production and consumption, respectively. And the funniest thing about this thing is that, and that is the issue with fossil fuel, some of the reserves are situated in some geographic locations. For instance, in the case of this Africa, Algeria, Angola, Libya, and Nigeria, as an account for about 85% of Africa's oil reserves and even production. So, and these 4 countries are members of OPEC. So as a result of that, these economies usually rely on, as in proceeds from fossil fuels, principally oil and gas. Now, just to take a further look into that, the energy consumption mix of the continent also reveals that fossil fuel remains the dominant fuels in the energy mix. We can see oil, coal, and natural gas in some, they account for more than 90% of the total energy mix. So while the contribution of so-called renewables, even including hydro, is about 8%. So that shows that there is a long way to go in this process. Now, what are the core issues that we need to address and the need for transition into renewable energy? The first one is that more than 600 million Africans lack access to electricity, as other panelists have rightly pointed out. Another point is that 80% rely on traditional biomass, as in fuel wood and charcoal for cooking. And another, this is the touching one, which we need to, sometimes the issue of the energy we are talking about, the impact is another thing that we need to consider. About 600,000 people die every year of indoor air pollution as a result of using fossil fuel, as in using fuel wood for their cooking and other domestic activities. So, and Africa as a continent also contributes more than 3% to the CO2 emission at the global level. But with those key factors, there are so many reasons why we need to consider transitioning into renewable energy. The continent is hugely endowed with several renewable energy resources, from solar, hydro, wind, geothermal, and even other upcoming or nascent renewable energy sources that are yet to be developed in the continent. So, and as a result of that, there is no African country that lacks renewable energy. At least you can see one or two in any of these countries. So, and the interesting thing is that the renewability of these resources also makes the availability to be virtually everywhere. And based on the estimation provided by the International Renewable Energy as an agency, they estimated that the total potential of concentrated solar PV and wind accounted for about 1,590 petawatt hour. So it's very huge amount of electricity or energy that can be generated from harnessing some of these renewable energy resources. Now, going forward, why do we need renewable? Apart from the things that I've mentioned earlier, the issue of energy security is very profound in the continent. The issue of availability, accessibility, affordability, and environmental friendliness of our energy sources. So this one is very critical, and it is really lacking in the continent. So we need to look into that, and which makes it very interesting and something we need to consider. Other reasons include the socioeconomic benefit in terms of job creation. It's been also estimated that the renewable energy industry has been providing more than 8 million jobs for people globally in different perspectives along the value chain of renewable energy. Another one is the environmental and health benefits in terms of some of the environmental impact of renewable, as in fossil fuel utilization. Some of the issues that we're experiencing, the issue of climate change, considering the strategic location of African continent, the impact of climate change is eating hard on the continent. This is evident in diverse areas, in the areas of can I call it the mega drought, the increasing rate of desertification, rising sea level, the crop failure, some of the climate change, the drought, and even some other issues that we're experiencing across the globe, as in across the continent rather. So are pointing to the fact that the impact of climate change is very huge in the continent. And another reason why we need renewable energy is the aspect of sustainability. So these are sources that are renewable, so they are always available. So what are the key areas that we can apply these renewable energy sources? In the area of electricity generation, for off-grid power generation in isolated remote areas, as in where electric power or grid may not be economically feasible. Other areas include in the residential aspect of cooking, air and water heating, cooling, and other areas. So we have the transportation industry as well, in the area of automobiles, using electric vehicles and digitalizing our rail system, our transportation system in diverse forms. Also in the industry, coming up with issue of using renewable energy like solar power and even some other available energy efficient equipment, just to ensure that
Dr. Natalia,
Yes.
Sorry, what would be your concluding remarks?
So in terms of the challenges, now these are some of the challenges that may delay the uptake or the transition into renewable energy into renewable energy uptake in the African continent. The heavy reliance of fossil fuel, the rapid population and the economic growth in the continent, the nascent rate of also the technological innovation, the absence of or inadequate transmission and distribution networks to transport or to convey the electricity, the absence of appropriate or apt financing and business models, inadequate or inappropriate policy and support mechanism to support the uptake of renewable energy resources, and also corruption. So in conclusion, the increasing rate of renewable energy deployment in some African countries like East Africa, some of they are at the forefront. In countries like Kenya, they are really doing well. And this one suggests that the transition is possible, but just that some of the issues that I've mentioned need to be properly addressed. This one will require, among other things, strong political will, investment, commitment, and also collaboration, regional collaboration, and other relevant support mechanism to ensure effective and rapid uptake of renewable energy technology in the African continent. So what I'm saying is that the transition is possible, but it may take time, and it will require huge investment on the part of individual country in the continent. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Nathaniel. We move forward to the next panelist. And that is Ms. Taciana, who would be addressing the question, continued use of natural gas in Africa. Are we ready to say goodbye to fossil fuels? Ms. Taciana, you are welcome on board.
Thank you so much, Pooja. Let me just share here my screen. So basically, this question, I will structure my presentation in 5 points: energy transition and the energy trilemma in Africa, a peripheral case. Then I will give a bit of example of the case of Mozambique, the sustainable management and governance of energy systems, transition versus progression, the new concept that Dr. Vittoria brings, and I think it's very interesting. First things first, towards universal access to energy and the way forward. What is the rule of law and regional cooperation? So we all know that central countries have already achieved the target of access to energy for all. And the primary concerns revolve around the sustainability of energy supply and management of the energy grid. In Africa, we know that our problems are much more complex. The links between the challenges to access to energy, sustainable development, and poverty eradication and climate change and gender equality are at the center of our debate. If we think about Mozambique as a peripheral case as well, we are not an exception to this reality. We live in energy poverty with low electrification ratio of around 30%. It's very difficult to balance energy security with energy affordability and environmental sustainability. Mozambique occupies one of the last 6 places in terms of energy management performance index. And at the same time, we have vast resources with biomass, natural gas, coal, hydro, wind, and solar. And actually, we have huge reserves of natural gas, mainly in the Rovuma Basin. And the expansion of our national grids depends mostly on the extraction and availability of fossil fuels. If we look into our recent policy legislative measures that were approved by our government in their 5-year government program, they try to create this balance. According with the International Energy Agency report from 2019, Mozambique can become the largest gas producer in sub-Saharan Africa by 2030. So what our government tried to do was to balance all these requirements from energy transition and the reality of the country. We target to increase access by 64% in 2024 with a contribution from renewable energies in order to ensure the safe energy supply in the country. But we also need to promote projects for the construction of energy infrastructures that are resilient to climate change and variability. We also need to expand the national grid through rural electrification and through the national grid itself. And there is a big focus on the development of the gas resources and the monetization of such gas resources with the development of the first four LNG units in the Rovuma Basin and the FLNG project, the development of a natural gas thermal power plant of 400 megawatts, and the construction of basic infrastructures that will link the north to the south of the country, called the backbone, and then the interconnector with Malawi. Lots of investment and lots of financing required. So how to effectively operate this energy transition or energy progression in our countries, how to make our energy systems more sustainable. It all depends on our geopolitics, the economic position in relation to the management of our natural resources in our countries, the greater or lesser independence on them, our philosophical and cultural concept of justice and gender relations. If you look again into the outlook for Africa of the International Energy Agency 2019, we see that gas in 2040 represents a huge portion of generation in sub-Saharan Africa, excluding South Africa. We also have a lot of solar PV, but gas has a huge stake together with hydro and solar. So in order to really tackle our energy concerns and our development and the sustainable development of our countries, what to do? I think, in my opinion, first things first. And in our current situation with the amount of energy access that we have in the continent, we have to assure universal access to energy to all as a fundamental human right to sustainable social and economic development, a realization of equality, and also of the ideal of justice. And the way forward, and I think this would be my recommendation at the moment, is that there are two main fundamental ways through the role of law. The law here has a fundamental role and must ensure achieving equal access to energy and the sustainability of the energy systems as a matter of justice and the way out of poverty. And also in a more pragmatic way, ensure and enhance the potential of our resources at the level of regional cooperation. So promote greater regional energy cooperation, integration, and pooling of our resources. Act together as an ecosystem. We should really act together as an ecosystem in order to achieve this transition or this progression, and development and implement a regional gas roadmap, working with regional development partners such as the SADC and regulators. And this was my contribution to the debate.
Thank you very much, Ms. Taciana. That was really within time and very precise. We head to the next question. So we would now welcome Mr. Peter Muliisa on board to answer the question, how practical is the Paris Agreement in Africa? Mr. Peter, you are welcome on board.
Thank you, Pooja, and good afternoon once again. I will not share a PowerPoint presentation now. I'll share it after, and then the organizers can send it to the participants. But listening to the presentations that have come before mine, my work has been eased because a lot of the questions have been answered. But just going to the question, I'll start by just briefly talking about the Paris Agreement, which everyone has sort of commented on, which was concluded at COP20 in Paris in 2015. And more than 179 countries at that conference committed to reducing global warming or increase in global temperatures to below 2%, and as far as possible to below 2 degrees Celsius, and as far as possible to 1.5 degrees Celsius. It came into force on 4th November 2016, after the minimum threshold was met. And the key target is really to achieve significant reduction in emission of greenhouse gases. It's largely built on voluntary country pledges to reduce emissions. And indeed, countries at the conference, countries that contribute more than 80% of emissions had already issued their commitments before the treaty, before the conference in Paris. The agreement, of course, had targets of up to 20, but it has commitments that go beyond 2020. It has mechanisms that spur action in developing countries, and as such, we have a green climate fund that was created to support developing countries in adaptation and mitigation of climate change impacts. It has an accountability mechanism that is quite transparent, in which countries' performance in line with the targets, with the commitments they made, is tracked and measured. And generally, to many, it was a great agreement that was built on work done before, while to others, it was just better than no agreement. And the key critics say it really deviated and moved much further from the Kyoto principles. Most African countries have ratified the Paris Agreement, and so there are commitments that African countries have taken on and to implement. But just going to the topic of how practical the Paris Agreement is to Africa, I'll just pick a few facts before I make my comment. So as indicated by, I think, one of the presenters before, Africa's contribution to gas emissions is the least. It stands between 3.6, 3.8% of the global. Africa, however, is one of the most vulnerable to climate change impacts. So that makes the Paris Agreement the only framework that we have really in managing emissions, very important to Africa. And how is it the most vulnerable as a continent? The poverty levels, the energy poverty situation that Africa sits in has already been stated by my colleagues. But just focusing on agriculture and other few issues. Agriculture accounts for about 30% of Africa's GDP, and 80% of Africa's population depend on nature-based agriculture. So that means if there is disruption in rains, if there is drought, all those people are vulnerable and they are at risk. So many commentators say that global warming, even below 2 degrees Celsius, that is the target of the Paris Agreement, would still impact food production in Africa by at least 15 to 20% reduction in food production. And that is significant because with the food shortage, you'll have impacts that will reverse achievements in Africa in the health and educational sector. You'll have conflicts that are created because of food insecurity. And of course, as indicated earlier, Africa has the lowest electricity penetration with high population growth, and very soon we'll have, if not already achieved, the youngest population in the whole world, and rapid urbanization. So all these definitely require energy, and if you don't have energy and you have food insecurity, you have a huge challenge. Focusing again on Africa's natural resources, and you've talked about oil and gas, you've talked about geothermal potential, there are other natural resources that are available in Africa. Most of them are not fully exploited. And if you went to the exploitation per acre of land in Europe and you compare it to Africa, you'll find that the exploitation per acre in Europe is much, much higher than the one in Africa. So there is a lot of resources that are untapped, that are unexploited. Now, from this, basically, you see that Africa, because of the impacts that any climate change will have on Africa, it becomes extremely important that Africa, at the very least, embraces this framework that the Paris Agreement gives to ensure that it harnesses and implements its move to ensure that it manages and mitigates, creates an adaptation structure for ensuring that climate change impacts do not affect Africa as much. So what does Africa need to ensure that it adapts to the climate change situation that it finds itself in, to avoid these impacts of drought and the others? The key thing is really financing. What we get from this whole conversation is that Africa needs to develop. And in developing, can we have a development-driven agenda that is pegged on clean energy? And the answer is yes. You can actually have that. There's significant research that shows that Africa could create significant jobs through harnessing its renewables, its clean energy structures to ensure that the energy mix in Africa has a significant growth in renewables. And there are countries like Bangladesh that have, poor as they might be, that have created jobs through renewables, and Africa should not be different. So in essence, what Africa needs to look at is to ensure that it sets reasonable targets in its adherence to the Paris Agreement. And these targets should consider its development agenda, its energy needs, and adaptation to climate change impacts. So basically, African countries should not be extremely ambitious in setting their national targets for climate change in compliance with the Paris Agreement. There should be clear policies that are structured to ensure that all the targets that are set are reasonable, enable development, but at the same time increase access to clean energy. In economies where oil and gas is the key area, is the key source of revenue, these countries definitely will have to focus on harnessing this oil and gas potential for their development, but at the same time to ensure that they set other areas, they use this oil and gas resource revenue to ensure that they develop renewables and clean energy, to have a good mix of clean energy that is in their energy mix. And the targets must be pegged on how much revenue you target to get out of oil and gas, and how you use it to balance the development of solar energy and other clean energy to supply the population. Of course, the energy demand that is growing in Africa is an opportunity for countries to drive policies that increase energy access, even using all the clean energy mechanisms that are available, especially solar that is predominantly available in Africa, and technologies that are ongoing right now. The technological development is ongoing right now, makes it cheaper, and it is continuing to make it cheaper to use solar energy to generate access to power. Of course, for the countries that are dependent on fossil fuels, the energy rents will reduce, the rents from these resources will reduce. So policy has to be put in place to ensure that these rents are transformed into cleaner energy development that spurs development, and reliance on rents is reduced, and economic development in other sectors is what comes out of these rents that are being got from oil and gas. According to some projections, it is true that clean energy development in Africa, and looking at the potential of Africa in clean energy, would achieve about 27% reduction in CO2 emissions by 2040 in Africa. So it's a real potential area, and it shows that it would improve jobs and livelihoods. It would improve access to power and access to energy by African countries. So in my view, is the Paris Agreement practical in Africa? It is, to a limited extent, practical in Africa. But because of the need to ensure that we manage the impacts of climate change, Africa needs to embrace the Paris Agreement, because it's the only framework that we have to address these impacts. Are the investments in Africa sufficient to ensure that we follow the Paris Agreement? And in following the Paris Agreement, we are able to also spur development. It's clear that the investments and the revenue base in Africa is still very low to support the development of mitigation measures that will sustainably protect Africa from impact. So the solution is largely in international support through the mechanisms that the Paris Agreement has set in place. But many analysts have indicated that those measures of cooperation under the Paris Agreement and through the funding are not sufficient. So generally, Africa has to find ways to generate revenue and investment to invest in its development and its clean energy mechanism to ensure that the adaptation of impacts caused by global warming are managed. So in essence, whereas the Paris Agreement provides a framework within which Africa can prepare itself to work on adaptation of the impacts of climate change, it is not sufficient. So Africa needs to find other ways to generate revenue. And indeed, when some commentators have indicated that even if domestic mobilization of revenues increases in Africa at the rate it is growing, it will not be enough to raise these revenues that are required for the investments to protect it against the impacts. So the solution is generally to develop the natural resources that are available, adopt them, and grow them to generate the revenue that is required to build on adaptation requirements, as well as build on sustainability of those adaptation solutions. So in brief, my concluding remarks would be that the Paris Agreement provides a framework within which Africa can manage and build a platform to respond to impacts of climate change, but it is not enough. The framework provided by the Paris Agreement is not enough, and Africa must necessarily find other avenues of revenue mobilization to grow its ability to adapt and mitigate climate changes. Is there potential for Africa in terms of growth and jobs out of adopting clean energy and setting targets that should be achieved under the Paris Agreement? And the answer would be absolutely yes, because there's a lot of potential for Africa to build renewable energies. Thank you. That would be my contribution to this debate.
Thank you very much, Mr. Peter, for the wonderful presentation. We will now head to the final question in our debate. And I welcome Dr. Geoffrey Mabea on board to answer the question, what does the future hold for the African energy sector in the energy transition era? Dr. Geoffrey, you're welcome on board.
Thank you, Pooja. I'm just trying to set up my slides over here. Could you please enable me to share my screen?
Dr. Victoria, could you work on the hosting of Dr. Mabea, please?
All right, I've handled that. He can share.
Thank you. Thank you so much, and it's really very interesting to participate in these debates about African energy debate. And indeed, we've received quite a number of presentations on that, and I'll be able to probably handle this from the regional perspective and also engage you on some of the things, some of the development, especially in the African context, on how we've handled this and what we're doing so far as energy transition is concerned. Now, briefly about REA, maybe I'll take a minute just to tell you about what we do at a regional level. As a regional organization, we are looking forward to harmonization of energy policies in the East African community, and also working with other regional regulators in Africa to ensure that we have energy policies or frameworks that are harmonized across. We are also looking at the monitoring the implementation process of these energy frameworks, renewables, as well as any other, as well as fossil fuel, and creation of tools, and also decisions that will enable Africa as a whole entrench and obviously take advantage of the resource that we have. Another thing that we do is capacity building to ensure that we have people who are well versed and understand on how to be able to go about the, the whole process. Now, we have learned from the other presenters of, a lot of statistics about Africa, but I'm very keen to probably bring you to speed on the 2019 statistics on the electrification rate in Africa, in particular the rural electrification rate, which is 28%, and of course the urban electrification rate, which stands at 67%. Now here we are looking at 600 million people in sub-Saharan Africa who have no access to electricity. And then now the question, one of the key things that probably I'll be able to handle from this point is what will be the success factors in the era of transition as Africa, or as regional organizations, or as individuals. One of the key things that we identify here is the institutional arrangement. And in the transition, we are looking at countries or facilitating institutions that are capable of cooperating, that are capable of increasing trade, that are capable of having robust designs, as well as those the institutions that are able to mitigate any foreseeable risks. We're also looking at infrastructure, enabling robust infrastructure. When we're looking at, for example, the power markets, we're looking at coupling these power markets in Africa as a whole, starting from the bilateral and then building it up to larger pools. Then we're also looking at funding gaps. Of course, this has been mentioned before. This is one of the critical areas that needs to be looked at so that we're able to achieve the goals that we have set in the transition, as well as in the increased energy access for Africa. Another key thing is the support of policies. Now, one of the questions that has been raised earlier was about what will be the benefits of enhancing this transition, and how will it benefit for example, the people, the consumers? And indeed, there are many other opportunities, or what we call the economic opportunities that may arise as a result of transitioning. It may take some time, but then it is very critical, and there are many opportunities that will arise from this. Probably one of the key things, especially in renewables, is like net metering and other obligations, which is very critical, in which consumers can be engaged in participating and also benefiting from this. We are also looking at promotion of competition and, of course, efficient pools or efficient electricity markets and power pools. At the moment, we do have 3 major pools. We are looking at the Eastern African power pool. We are looking at the Western African power pool and the Southern African power pools. Now, these systems, the reason I'm mentioning the systems is because without a robust infrastructure, the energy access will be far-fetched. So this is one of the key things that we need to look at, and how we can be able to work together to build them up. And then the other point on this is what we call the Renewable Energy Continuum Framework, or the implementation timelines. Now, it is very important that we have strategies that are specific and that are achievable, and that they are very, staggered in a way that they can be achieved in country as well as regionally. So maybe just to take you briefly about this renewable energy integration continuum. Essentially, this is a framework which allows the countries to navigate through the challenges that they have. And here we are looking at the 4 quadrants. One, for example, quadrant A is a limited integration and, of course, limited power markets. This is in particular for electricity markets, and of course this is where most of the African countries are. We have quite low level of renewable energy integration, and of course the policy is not adequate. Of course, this is we also have environmental concerns. The energy is expensive. So essentially, I'm looking at wholesome. We're not just looking at the transiting. There are several other factors you have to consider before you think of transiting from the fossil fuel-based energy to renewable energy. And also lack of transition plan. This is very important, that our transition plan has to be laid down very carefully. And of course, considering the capacity mechanism and the system flexibility, because before you think of renewable, be it off-grid or maybe on-grid or mini-grids or super-grids, then the system flexibility has to be there. We have also to look at the institutions that will enable this transition to take place, and several other things. And then from there you move to quadrant B, which is a good integration, but limited market. But at this point, you see that things are starting to evolve. You see that issues like capacity mechanism is being addressed, the policies being drafted, the energy, medium carbon system, and adequate infrastructure. Then move to quadrant C, where we have now substantial renewable integration, good policies, as well as, is there a question? Sorry, as well as good infrastructure and robust system balance. And then lastly is the quadrant D, where we expect Africa in the near future will be able to have affordable energy, a complete transition, and of course, health competition, a well-designed auxiliary services, and high penetration. Then here we'll be able to have what we call a complete transition. You'll find probably this research or more framework in the paper that I've indicated. Maybe you'll be able to go and find out more about it. Now, lastly, maybe just to bring you to speed on some of the things that we are doing as regional entity and Africa-wide to be able to assist in the transition. One of the key things that we are doing right now is we are designing the African single electricity market. And also we are also doing what we call the Continental Master Plan. We are also doing you know, the transmission tariff methodologies, and for renewables, especially for off-grids. At the moment, there is the energy efficiency quality assurance framework for off-grid appliances, so that when these appliances, when the systems, when the transition is taking place, there are already existing frameworks, assurance frameworks that will enable them work efficiently and work properly, and also to be able to integrate. And one of the key things that we find, or one of the key things that has been a challenge, is the tariffs. This is one of the key things that the continent is looking at to ensure that we have a standardized way of pricing, so that if in future, as the pools integrate, or as any other resources integrate, we're able to have one voice and one way of looking at things. So I think at a regional level as well as the continental level, there has been a lot of development, especially renewables. We also have institutions that have been created to look into this. Now, energy transition is possible. However, timing is very important, and we should not rush into it. We need to be very strategic, and we need to work very closely at the national level as well as the regional level in ensuring that we have the very best strategy in transitioning. Energy mix is very important, and at the same time, it is very important to create clear goals and the benefits that arise from transitioning. I think, in my view, if we have best strategies, if we have best timing, and we have the best design, then we are able to transition at the right time. This is
Dr. Mabea.
Thank you.
Sorry for the interruption. What would be your concluding remarks? You have like 2 minutes.
Yes, actually, I'd already finished, but what I was saying is that transition is possible, but what we need to be clear is to have well-laid strategies on transitioning, ensure that we have pretty well analyzed benefits of transitioning, and alternatives for funding, and also cooperation within and without the region. It is possible. It should be long-term. It should be strategic. Thank you.
Thank you very much for the wonderful presentation, Dr. Mabea. We would now invite some of our participants who have raised or prompted their hands for participation for question discussions. Dr. Victoria, do you mind taking up from there?
Thank you, Pooja. But I thought you would go through with the questions, because I've been responding to most of my questions personally, and most of them were relating to how African countries can still utilize fossil fuels with the global pressure to transition to a low carbon economy. And like I've emphasized, it's not that African countries are climate change deniers, because we already see lots of initiatives to embrace renewable energy and energy efficiency at both the national level and also at the regional level. Like some question I got on the regional efforts going on, we have seen renewable energy and energy efficiency centers being established at the East African community. They also have one at ECOWAS. They have one in Southern Africa under SADC. So we are seeing lots of efforts to embrace clean energy. But however, like most of the panelists have mentioned, there's some areas where we still need fossil fuels. And for me, like I've mentioned in my answers, we have to embrace cleaner technology, like carbon capture and storage, so that we can still utilize fossil fuels in a way that is not so detrimental to the environment. So that's the main, I think that's a summary of most of the questions that came through for me. And I think other panelists can also, they've been going through the questions, they can summarize some of their answers. I'll call upon Dr. Nathaniel.
Okay, thank you very much. While I also have been responding to some of the questions that were asked regarding my presentation, just to address one more regarding somebody asked about the issue of corruption. That's why or how do I think corruption can impact a renewable energy project or energy transition? Yes, from different reports that we've been reading, apart from the ones that I'm even well abreast about, it's the fact that the issue of fund misappropriation, embezzlement, as in, is very alarming, even in the continent. Apart from the fact that the corruption index of the continent its own, it's very, very, as in most of the countries in the continent, they have ranked the corruption level as in is very high. So the corruption is a major issue in the African continent, very major part. As an African, it's something that we need to address effectively so as not to jeopardize the future or the transitioning process that we are looking forward to achieve. And also, I would like to emphasize the need for investment in new networks, as in for power transmission and generation. In terms of the T&D loss in the country, in the continent is very huge, which is far above the international standard of 21%. So in most African countries, the value is very high. In fact, for some countries, about 34%. So these are some of the areas where we can even save some of the energy that we're even generating. And the area of energy efficiency and energy conservation, changing our lifestyle, our behavior, some of the things that we are doing, that we are just wasting the energy, owning the light, as in when we are not at home. So these are some of the avenues that we can use our energy utilization and then save energy for other productive usage. Thank you.
And then Peter, would you like to address some questions? I saw a question here from Rokonge Mohongo, where he's asking about, he's like, may one please explain the role of political settlements on energy transition, because fossil fuels are not only lucrative, but easy to regulate since they belong to the state, unlike sources of renewable energy. And I know, Peter, you work with the Uganda National Oil Company, so I think you're the best panelist to address the issue of political will with respect to transitioning to a low carbon economy, maybe from the UNOCEC perspective.
Just to have a few more questions that I'll probably attempt to respond to, as well as this one. And I think that most of the questions that are coming through in text largely on how African countries can realistically set targets for clean energy initiatives or for reducing emissions. And I think the baseline of my statement would be that countries must necessarily set reasonable targets that enable them to develop their energy requirements, enable their economies to grow, and at the same time move towards clean energy. So if we set very ambitious targets that do not spur development, will have impacts of climate change and will fail to adapt to them as countries, and at the end of the day, it will be catastrophic for many of our people. So in essence, in response to the climate change initiatives that are embodied in the Paris Agreement, it's absolutely important that countries look at their requirements, their needs, their projections, and set reasonable, realistic targets that will enable them to develop, but also harness and take advantage of the many renewable energy, clean energy availabilities in Africa that are not fully tapped or developed. Going to political will in relation to clean energy, I think most countries will realize that climate change is a reality. Reduction of emissions is definitely a challenge for everybody, and everyone must adopt and be able to contribute to the reduction of emissions. And as I indicated, it doesn't matter that Africa contributes very little the global, to the general emissions. The impact that Africa will have should be the reason Africa is motivated to support clean energy movements. That said, many African countries are developing oil and gas projects. Others are heavily reliant on oil and gas projects for their revenue and growth. So for those countries, it will be definitely very difficult to easily adopt and move from fossil fuels reliance. And for those countries, definitely they must have a transitional structure, transitional plan. How do you move from heavy reliance on fossil fuels? Can you use the fossil fuels revenue and the structures to spur, to move towards cleaner energy? What's your kind of mix? How do you structure your energy mix 20, 30 years from today? And that's a policy issue. So whereas countries may have issues with planning around that, the reality of the world is that 20 to 30 years from today, the reality of the market will force countries to do that. So it's my thoughts would be that it is best that countries start planning right now on how to transition, or at least to improve the energy mix of those particular countries. Thank you.
All right, thank you. And then I'll call upon Dr. Mabea to respond to some of the questions. You can summarize, because I see you've been responding to most of them, but then you can respond to some which you feel you need to respond to.
Thank you, Dr. Nalule. Basically, I've answered almost all the questions that have been asked, but probably just a few. I don't know if there is any that I have not answered, but let me try to answer one fundamental one that I found is very intriguing about the access rate and how Africa can be able, to accelerate the energy access rate, especially now that we are looking at, a very low percentage African-wide, and the ways, some of the approaches we can be able to put in place to achieve this. Now, one of the key things we need to understand here is that when we are, doing the transition, we have to consider several other factors. One of the things is the population and how sparsely our population is in Africa. We are so fortunate that most of the people in Africa are living in remote areas, which is very advantageous actually, but disadvantageous to systems, to some infrastructure, for example, the transmission infrastructure. And therefore, some of the things or some of the mechanisms that could be achieved could be like off-grid, the mini grids, and of course the mini grids are very important. But this can only be achieved if we have policies that have been developed, because mini grids and off grids can also benefit the consumers. For example, mini grids, when we have very nice policies like net metering, we will find that the consumers will be benefiting from these resources. In fact, many consumers will be benefiting from the net metering once it has been put in place. But this is only possible if we have robust policies in place. And with this kind of strategic approach or timing, then it's easier for us to increase the access rate in Africa. We don't have to wait for major or big infrastructure. We have to start small, and then we can be able to integrate. So long as we have system flexibility for us to be able to have the renewable integrated into the system, it's very easy for us to move forward slowly but surely. Thank you.
All right, thank you. I'll call upon you, Dr. Geoffrey Wood, to make your concluding remarks and also trying to answer some of the questions that have been raised.
Okay, thank you, Victoria. So what I'll do is I'll summarize some of the questions I've got. I've been answering some of them as others have been speaking. One of them was, how do we build capacity in Africa for energy transition? Another one was, what is COVID-19 on greenhouse gas emissions? What are the implications going forward for action towards energy transmission? I'll take that one first. So coronavirus pandemic has been unprecedented and quite frankly terrifying. In terms of greenhouse gas emissions, daily global emissions during the period of the most lockdowns in nations across the world decreased by 17% on average by early April compared to mean 2019 levels. Just under 50% of the reductions came from the transport sector alone. In terms of impact on 2020 annual emissions, if the pre-pandemic conditions remain by mid-June, then what we're seeing is an estimated reduction globally of 4%. If some form of restrictions last until the end of 2020, we're looking at a 7% reduction in emissions. So given that most of the Western world shut down for between 2 and 3 months and counting, this is a very small amount. There's a couple of points here that are important. One, the golden thread running through this, that it has shown that the political will is critical. And it's government action has resulted in the reduction in these emissions. That's the first point, albeit that the reason not for climate change, but for virus. Seems like I'm provoking debate in the background already. The second point is you have to ask how sustainable are these cuts? So it's all very well stopping your economies now, but we can't stop our economies permanently. So really, this is the moment in time when countries should be enacting new policies to continue some of these emissions reductions. These are difficult questions, and they're political and they're economic questions rather than scientific questions. The other one about building capacity in Africa, well, the barriers are, once again, lack of political will, because if a government wants to do something, it can at least make the attempt to do it, and it can make some inroads into it. Realities are not that simple, but you need political will. Another barrier is centralization of decision making. This is not a problem to Africa. This is a problem globally, even in my beloved Scotland, where a lot of decision makings are centralized. And what you need to overcome these barriers is greater dialogue and new partnerships to overcome a disconnect between the various stakeholders and shareholders. Practical wise, map resource-rich and, importantly, cost-effective areas for renewable energy deployment. Enhance government capacity and knowledge in these novel areas. What we saw in the UK, for example, back in the 1990s, companies would come over and say, we want to build onshore wind farms. Planning departments would refuse them because they didn't fit into the planning legal system and they didn't know how to deal with them. So there would be an automatic rejection rather than a consideration. And also strategic planning. So we saw some very interesting discussions there about Pan-African energy policy, energy markets. So enhanced strategic planning, but also public consultation.
Okay, would you please try to summarize, Geoffrey?
I'm almost finished, yes. So just 1 second, if I may. And the important point is public consultation. You need to bring people on board. You can't just force new infrastructure, new ways of doing things into communities. Give them a role in decision making, give them a role in revenue streams. Okay, thank you.
All right, thank you very much. And then Taciana, could you please respond to some of the questions? I've been seeing many questions on gas. So could you summarize some of the questions you've been responding to and those you weren't able to respond to? And that will be the end of the webinar. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Victoria. I think that the majority of the questions were related to the fact if we have in Mozambique, as I used as a case, if we have like a strategy or if we do any comparison with other countries, and if in a way, if we represent Africa. Of course we don't. And we know that mostly in the northern part of Africa, countries have a different energy mix and different concerns, some of their countries. But I think that in sub-Saharan Africa, we have and we share the same concerns. And my point in my presentation was actually to foster this regional cooperation in terms of research, in terms of master plans that also Dr. Mabea mentioned. And actually, I also dropped him a question in respect to the status of those important African instruments. And we all know that it's difficult from a political side, mainly from our regional communities and African Union to effectivate the instruments that we are approving. And I think that is one of our main challenges, is to how to implement and enforce those instruments, because those are the instruments that will create the African vision or the regional's visions about energy needs and energy justice. And the development of our infrastructures. And I would like also to tackle a point about energy justice. Someone asked, how can we talk about energy justice? And I do think that, for example, the fact that we need to develop more renewable projects, for example, to tackle rural electrification should be done in conjunction with the communities. And that is one of the faces of energy justice. So energy justice, it's about redistribution of the royalties that are coming from the management of our natural resources, oil and gas projects. It's coming also from the application of the law in an articulated manner and transversal manner in order to tackle the sustainability and also poverty issues and sustainable development of our populations. But it also has to go to local. And I think that a good way is also partnerships with our local communities, for example, to develop renewable projects.
Thank you very much, Taciana. So we've responded to most of your questions and you've heard from the panelists, and that marks the end of our webinar because we are really time conscious. But however, since we still have many people online, we have over 150 people online, would like to make this a very interactive session and we can hear from some of our participants. I see I've promoted most of you. So James Nyamongo, Deng, I see Abdul, Stewart, please feel free to say hello so that we can get to see your faces and also you indicate the country you're coming from. James Nyamongo, and then others you can follow. But this is, the webinar has ended. Thank you very much. This is the end of our webinar, but would like to just have a short networking session so that the panelists can know where you're coming from. Thank you very much.
Hello, good afternoon, everybody. Thank you so much for giving me this opportunity. And I want to take this opportunity to thank the panelists for their contribution, especially to this important topic. My name, as Victoria said, is James Nyamongo from Kenya and an alumni of CEPMLP. One thing which probably I would like to comment on this is that the African countries have got the potential, especially on both fossil or renewable and fossil energies. What we are lacking actually is that the unanimous agreements whereby each countries probably will come together. For example, if you take a country like Congo, there's got enormous resources of hydroelectric power, which can actually light the entire Africa. Take Mozambique, the same on gas. So what is actually required is political will. And we have this political will whereby, like Europeans, whereby they are looking at, let's say, economic power, but they are not considering politics to come in and interrupt, especially in the supply of energy. Then our continent will be a great country. Thank you so much, and keep up the momentum.
Thank you very much. And thank you very much, James, for all your support. I must note he attends all our webinars, and he is also a very high level policymaker in Kenya, working with the Kenya pipeline. So we definitely need policymakers in these discussions so that we can move things forward on the African continent. Deng Jewett from South Sudan, do you want to say hello?
Hello, everybody. I'm really happy to see Dr. Amba over there and Nathaniel. This was really good. I am from South Sudan. I am a student here, PhD student here at the center. And I'm looking into the impact of extractive industry, socio-economic and environmental impact of extractive industry on local communities. Basically to see how do these big companies goes into African countries, sign contract with the government and go into the communities, getting land and exploit the natural resources. What are the impact and how can we reduce the impact, finding mitigation ways, as well as embedding the energy justice to see how we can have policies that really don't bring negative impact to the local communities. I am really happy to see you all. I am always here to listen to my really good researchers like Dr. Mba and Nathaniel. Thank you all.
All right, thank you. I see Tosin from Nigeria, from the Ministry of Energy. Tosin, would you like to say hello?
Hello.
Yes, Tosin.
Okay, hi, Victoria. Well, thank you to all the participants. This was a very interesting debate, and it's one that has been it's been in the works for a while. So I was just going to I hear a lot of people talking about political will, but from the ministry, because I work in the Ministry of Energy, and I know that there is some push for renewables, but there's also the issue of financing. So even though the politicians are all trying to get renewables, but how do we actually get this financing to Africa? So I think again. All right.
Oh, all right, I think we've lost you, Tosin. I see Makuta from Sierra Leone. Makuta, do you want to say hello? And then I see Dennis from Ghana. Yes, we want to hear from all of you. Makuta Mati, do you want to say hello to us?
Yeah, hi everyone. I'm Makuta from Sierra Leone. I'm also a PhD student here at the University of Dundee. I just want to thank all the participants and especially Dr. Nalule. This has been very interesting webinar and very insightful. That's all.
All right, thank you very much. Dennis from Ghana, do you want to say hello to us? Dennis Asare, are you online? All right, I see Stuart Kasozi. Guys, feel free, just say hello. I see Joel Biaruhanga, I see Susanna. Say hello because the webinar has ended, but you can just say hi to the participants and then we close.
All right, thank you everyone. Thank you all participants. I'm Stuart Kasozi from Uganda. I'm currently studying Masters in Sustainable Electrical Power at Brunel University, London. So I'm an electrical engineer working with Uganda Electricity Transmission Company Limited. So I'm carrying out a study on the impact of increased renewable energy generation to grid stabilities. So as we campaign for more use of renewable energies globally, it has great impact on the stability of the electricity network, and that might affect the industrialization and urbanization of African countries, because most industries actually need a stable power supply to do a lot of production. So the topic for African countries should actually rely more on carbon capturing mechanisms because we are on the path of urbanization, as we also consider renewable energy harnessing. So that's my take, but thanks for the insightful presentation, everyone. It was really great seeing you all.
All right, I see Takle from Ethiopia. Takle, would you like to say hello to us? All right, and then I saw Amri from Tanzania. I see Leonardo. Guys, if you want to say hi, Joel, Jocelyn, David from Nigeria. Before I close the webinar, because once we reach below 100, I'll stop this webinar, but feel free to socialize, please.
Yes, thank you, Victoria. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Leonard Cheng. I'm from Kenya. That's a wonderful presentation from the panelists. As we're struggling as an Africans to try and move from non-renewable to renewable energy, the one challenge that I still face is the fact that as much as countries have a right to development, and at the same time they have a right to protect the environment, how they're going to balance those. If you look at some of our contracts that people are getting into, one big challenge is that they tend to attract investors, but they are not looking at how to protect the environment. So I don't know how best you're going to move, but that is a topic for another discussion. But otherwise, thank you for everything.
All right, I see Chibenze from Nigeria. I think you wanted to say hi. You asked me to promote you.
Hi, thank you, Victoria. My name is Chibenze Ezekiel. I'm actually based in Ghana.
Okay.
So I think it's been a very useful conversation, and I've learned a lot from the African perspective. But one thing that comes to mind was one of the presenters who was saying that there's currently no consensus on the issue around energy transition. And I think that this is something that perhaps at the AU level, we must take it very seriously. Whilst we do say that Africa emits just about 3% of carbon emissions, or we contribute to the emissions. What can we do at our level to contribute to the cutting down of these emissions, even at the country level? I mean, because even though countries have their own NDCs as part of the Paris Climate Agreement, what can we? And because I know we all come from different backgrounds, CSOs, private sector, government agencies, how do we work together, at the national level to be able to contribute our quota? So, and I'm hoping that we can have this conversation moving forward, so we can see what we can do collectively, in Africa, to help our government to also, cut down carbon emissions as a way of achieving the Paris Agreement, and also through energy transition initiatives. Thank you, Victoria.
All right, thank you. Anyone else would like to say hello to us? This is just an session.
Hi, okay. Victoria, I'm David. Thank you for the opportunity to come in and comment. I think it's a very interesting debate.
Let me just put my glasses on so that
the progression transmission debate. My view is.
Please mute your mic if you're not speaking. Yes, David, 2 minutes only so that other people can also get a chance to say hello. And in 5 minutes, I'll be closing this webinar. So 2 minutes, guys. All right, I think, David, we've lost you, or you've muted yourself.
Patrick is here from Geneva.
Yes, Patrick.
Hi, Dr. Victoria. Thank you very much for this opportunity.